If it's okay with you, I don't know how long it's been, but would we be able to talk and play the 911 call with you?
Not with me here.
Okay. Can you tell me why?
No, I will not listen to the 911 tape. I've heard it, but I don't allow myself to be hurt like that anymore.
Abilene 911, go ahead.
I actually killed somebody. She's bleeding all over the bed because I stabbed her.
Okay, where'd you stab her?
Lots of places.
When I listen to that 911 tape, one, I go right back to that night. Hearing his voice and knowing, like, hearing him lie. I don't want to hear the fake crying and everything, because all it does, and you can probably already tell, is it brings back the rage from that first moments of learning who he is as a person. They brought her out of the house, and I kept telling her, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea. There was nothing I could do except sit there and just fall apart and lose everything.
You think you killed somebody?
No, I know I did. My sister.
From the moment that Paris killed Ella, I had to become a divided mother, because up until that point, it never felt wrong to love either one of my children.
I look at the two of them and I'm like, oh God, what have I created?
Nobody prepares you for when it's the two people you love most in the world and one kills the other. What do you do then? So this is my office, and well, it's just maybe an extension of my personality. Artwork by my kids. These are all letters between Paris and I. And for the first 4 or 5 years, I mean, he wrote all the time. Long, long letters. So this is really old and dirty, but this is Paris's footprint from the day that he was born. It is just so amazing to me, you know, to think that they go from this tiny little thing to whatever they grow up to be. I miss that Paris. I would love nothing more than to have that Paris back. But, you know, I try not to spend too much time thinking about that. It's never going to happen. So this is Paris, probably around 26 or 27 years old. It's almost like whatever expression he has on his face and stuff, it just never makes it to his eyes. He's just very calm and placid. That's what I think of when I think of Paris. Cold lakes with dark bottoms. Do I think I ever knew the real Paris? No. I think I know more of the real Paris now. But at that time, I had no concerns that he was going to become who he is now. So the only thing that I've ever been able to tell parents over the years is you are not alone. and that it's, okay to talk about it and deal with it for the rest of your life. If you really think about it, Paris saved me, but he wasn't born to be my savior. Just like he destroyed me, but he wasn't born to be my destroyer, right? I mean, for sure, over the years, that's been a very hard contradiction to hold on to. The fact that the first person that I ever loved that much did that, yes. So that's when I got, sober. I had a purpose. When Paris was born, I had no idea that there was an actual, real love like that, but I had dreamed about it my entire life, hoping that it was real. Like, I had never seen anything so perfect in my life. I told him I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. But I promise I will always love you, and I will always be there for you, no matter what. I saw it as a new chapter, and, well, stories don't always go the way you want them to. When Paris was young and I had to go to work or go to class, I would take him to, his daycare center. And he was always fine. He would, give me my hug and go and play and all of that stuff. And then I would come back, that moment where he would turn around and see me, no matter what he was doing, he would turn around and he would see me, and his face would light up, and he'd Mom, and run across the room and jump into your arms. When your kid looks at you like that, that is the best feeling in the whole wide world. I just love that feeling. I can still remember that feeling. But he laughed a lot. He was a goofy kid. He wasn't dark or troublesome. He was just a kid who seemed happy. No signs of anything, right? I had nothing. Paris was with me the day I found out I was pregnant with Ella. He was playing with this Lego that he had built. And when the doctor came in and she was like, "Oh, congratulations, you're having a baby," he dropped it and it just shattered everywhere. Paris hated it. He was not a happy camper. Mostly it all boils down to, I don't want to share my mom. So the day Ella was born, he came into the room, and I was so worried. I was like, "Oh, please let this go well." And then he saw Ella. "Do you want to hold her?" And he was like, "Yeah." And he took her, and he looked down at her, and then he looked up at me, and he had this look on his face, and he was like, "Oh, Mama." He said, "She is beautiful. I love her. And I'm like, oh, thank God. Oh, thank God.
Enak kata Ellie, talk to me.
He fell in love immediately. I saw it happen on his face. And it really, really, really felt authentic to me. After he was arrested, there were still times when I walked into that prison that for a half second, maybe an eighth of a second, maybe less, I'd still get that look from Paris. And then everything that had happened would come between us. And then I remember my son is a psychopath. He murdered his sister. When everything first happened, there was no way I could look at pictures from the past. But now when I look at these pictures, you know, I can look and I see Paris and I remember the moment and everything. But all the memories have a little bit of sadness in them. That's how I feel when I look at all these pictures. So this picture of Paris and Ella was taken not long after Ella was born. I think it's pretty obvious from the picture he is no longer the child that does not want anything to do with a pregnancy or a little sister. It was a complete 180. I mean, and it happened instantaneously. And, you know, they would just hang out together. He would talk to her, play with her.
Ella. Ella.
He really enjoyed Ella. I don't remember at any point in time ever feeling worried with Paris around Ella. It's like people think that I sat and watched Paris turn into a psychopathic monster over the years and never did anything to save my daughter. And, you know, they're wrong. He was a really good big brother. I immediately saw what I thought was a good sibling relationship. I remember Ella got colic, and for like 3 months, Ella is just screaming. And she had this toy plastic phone. She could like push the buttons on, and it had like princesses would talk to you. And Paris figured out that if he put this phone up to her ear and he kept the thing ringing, that she would lay there with this phone ringing and be like, he took it upon himself to keep the phone up there and keep pushing the button so she'd be happy. I remember thinking, what an amazing big brother, that he's willing to do that for his sister. Well, I asked him if he remembered it. I said, do you remember that time? I said, it's little things like that, Paris, that make it so hard for me to understand why you killed your sister. And he laughed, and he said, yeah, I remember that. He said, you know what I was honestly thinking? He said, I remember thinking, why won't she just shut the F up? And that is not what I saw at all.
What do you have to say, Ella?
I saw a big brother helping his sister feel better. I never thought that he was going to hurt anybody. But then again, I learned after Paris that we don't really know anybody like we think we do. You know, even the people closest to us We don't know what's going on inside their head. I don't think I knew that Paris. I think that all children have a point where they realize for the first time that their parents aren't godlike, they're human. So I think it was almost like culture shock, maybe, because Paris had never seen the addict part of my personality. I mean, he saw me acting erratically and impulsively. It had to have been hard for him. He was starting to isolate more. I mean, he became moodier, and it got pretty ugly. So one day, I asked Paris to sit down, and I'm like trying to have a conversation with him. And the entire time that I'm trying to have a conversation with him, he's just looking at me, no expression on his face, deadpan. And he's going, bitch, whore, slut, bitch, whore, slut. Just repeating it over and over and over while I'm trying to talk to him. Never seen him talk to me like that before. But when I would try to be like, listen, I get it, you're mad. That's a little much. Like, I am still your mother. He didn't care. He lost all respect for me. I had never seen him act like that before. I definitely believe that my relapse played a role in what he did to Ella. But I never still, through all of that, would have thought he had homicidal thoughts. He hid it pretty damn well. I was running late for work because Ella was in the bathtub. The sitter was in there with her, and she kept saying to me, just one more hug, Mama, just one more kiss. She's wet, you know, I've got dressed for work, she's all wet. And I'm like, okay. So I give her a hug and a kiss, and I'm like, that'll dry before I get to work. And I go to like leave, and she's like, wait. There's one more hug, one more kiss. And I think she did that like 3 or 4 times. But, you know, I wasn't gonna give up the opportunity to hug her. It didn't matter that my work shirt was soaking wet. And I'm so glad now that I gave her every single one. That I was late, that I was wet. Yeah, because that's the last time I ever got to do that. He was angry with me when I left for work.
Paris?
I remember giving him a hug next to the front door. And I remember telling him, I know you're mad at me right now and you don't want to talk to me. But just remember, I love you and we can get through anything together. And he was just looking at me, just that calm, cold stillness. When I left, he had already made up his mind to kill somebody. The first year, I didn't really go out at all. Way too much anxiety. panic attacks, crying. I mean, I could not hold myself together in public. There was the depression, there was the rage. I mean, guilt was really, really, really heavy on me for the longest time. I mean, it's been 18 years, and I still don't really enjoy being in public. You know, when I see a brother and sister that look like they're about the same age difference, I look at them and I think to myself, what the hell happened? I'm her mom, you know, I was supposed to protect her. And I didn't. Still, at this point, 18 years later, I mean, it doesn't ever go away. They asked me to sit down, and at this point, I'm so worked up. They're like, your daughter has been hurt, is what they told me. So as a mom, when you hear your child has been hurt, you don't want to sit around and hear anything else. I said, take me to my daughter now. And then they said, well, she's dead. And at that point, I just remember losing consciousness, blacking out. And then I remember processing in my mind, well, if Ella's hurt and she's gone, they haven't said anything about Paris. Like, where's Paris? And then that's when they told me that they had Paris in custody because he was the one who murdered his little sister. And at that point, the only thing I can really remember is I felt like they made no sense. I remember feeling like I just had to get out of there. I just had to get to my kids. I jumped in my car and I took off, and they're all following me home, and I drove up to my house. I haven't talked about this in a long time. There are media vans all over the road. And they brought her out of the house. And as soon as they brought the stretcher out of the house, then I saw her in that bag. I lost my hearing. I didn't hear a thing. I could see people talking at me. I could see their mouths moving, but I couldn't hear a thing they were saying. And I went over to Ella. She had a black eye. She had this big contusion, this big bump on her head. And I kept telling her, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea. I kept telling her not to leave me. I was the mother to them both. I am the mother of the victim, and I am the mother of the murderer. The only thing I wanted more than having Ella back at that point was to be able to see my baby because as crazy as it sounds, I had just seen a dead child of mine. And even though I knew he was the reason for the pain I was in, he is my baby too. And I need to have hands on him to know that he is okay. I need to see with my eyes that this other love of mine is physically sound. That's the only thing I cared about. I needed to see my child. I asked so many times for somebody to take me to my child, and they would not take me to see Paris. They said that he had not asked for me, and until he asked for me, I could not see him. And I didn't know what to do. There was nothing I could do except sit there and just fall apart and lose everything. And everybody left. And then I was sitting in my house on my couch, and the house was so quiet, so quiet. I hadn't lived in a quiet house for 13 years, and it was so quiet. And as I'm like sitting there on the couch, you know, I haven't slept now for 24 hours. I'm looking out the front window, and this school bus pulled up to pick up the kids across the street, and it hit me. It like really hit me. I will never be doing anything like that again. And why do they get to put their kids on the bus and mine are gone?
For those of you that did not know it was that well, or know my children that well, music was something that my children and I could always relate to. Ella wanted to be a singer. Paris has always loved his music, and I don't really know what to say at a time like this because, you know, what can you say? So, but I do want to say thank you so much for keeping us in your thoughts. And please keep Paris in your thoughts. He needs a lot of support right now. And thank you. Thank you for being here.
After Paris killed Ella, I had to remind myself on a daily basis, this is not a monster. This is your son, and you love him, and he is a human being. In my mind, I had to separate. On one side, I was Ella's mom, and on this side, I was Paris's mom. And sometimes, in order to be his mom, I had to shut this door for a little bit. And it's just what I had to do. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had not been there for my child. I had already lost everything. I was not going to lose my sense of who I was as a person. I wasn't going to let anybody take that from me. I finally get to go see Paris. And I mean, I don't even have the words or know how to begin to explain how messed up I was. And when I came in the room, Paris was sitting in the corner, the farthest corner, I remember. It was like he was in his defensive position. And he was just looking at me, like he was just waiting to see what I was going to do. I just walked across the room to him and I pulled him up out of the chair and I just hugged him. I'm shaking, I'm crying, I'm like panicking, I'm shell-shocked. I mean, I can't even begin to explain it. And then I realized as I'm hugging him that he's not hugging me back. I mean, he wasn't doing anything, just like dead. And I kind of like pulled back some, you know, and he looks at me and he goes, "So what are you gonna do now?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "You always told me that the only way you could ever hurt somebody, kill somebody, is if they hurt one of your children." He said, "So what are you gonna do now?" And I remember thinking, who is this person? And where is my Paris? And feeling so unnerved. I don't really know how to explain it. He was a different person. It was the very first time I ever saw behind that mask. And so I just told him, I have no clue what we're gonna do now. But I made you a promise once when you were born that I was gonna love you no matter what. And I'm always gonna do the best I can to be a good mom to you. And I don't know what that looks like now, but that's what I'm still gonna do.
How old is Ella?
4. I woke up and I was hallucinating.
You're hallucinating?
Yes, and I thought my sister was a demon and I killed her.
He told the police he laid down with Ella to help her go to sleep. And that he must have fallen asleep also. And then at some point, he woke up and he looked over and he saw a pumpkin-headed demon thing, and that he thought he had to kill it in order to protect Ella. And that is not the way that it happened at all. What really happened to Ella that night was Paris convinced the babysitter to leave. He goes to the kitchen. He gets the knife. He came into the room. Ella's sleeping. The first thing he did to her was hit her. Because he told me later that he wanted her to be awake because he wanted her to know who was hurting her. And he stabbed her 17 times after beating her and choking her. And he really, really enjoyed it. There was semen found on the inside of Paris's underwear. And the theory is that the act of murder, you know, caused him sexual pleasure. After I learned that my son derived pleasure from seeing people suffer. For the first time, I started to wonder, like, is my son evil? All right, so here we have a whole bunch of letters. Some are just about, music. Some are about what he's doing at school there. Some of the letters hurt me more than others. He says, I remembered something the other day. I've told you that I thought about killing someone subconsciously for a while before I killed Ella. I remembered yesterday that I had thought about it acutely in 5th grade. When you took away my video games, I thought about how if I killed you, Ella and I could do whatever we wanted. And you know how I thought about doing it? Stabbing you in your sleep. Morbid irony. I did not see a child who was sitting in his bedroom calculating how to murder me so he could play his video games. I didn't see that person until Ella died. I do miss this face. I mean, I've had to stop myself a couple of times from like writing a letter. And, when my mom died, I talked to him because, I had cut off all contact. And then when my mother died last year and, he was calling to talk to my mother, I had to answer the phone and tell him. I answered the phone and he was like, is this you, Mom? And, he sounded, of course he sounded like Paris. He is Paris, but, I heard his voice and it just kind of fell back into those old patterns. And, he was like, is this you, Mom? And I was like, yeah, it's me. Hey, kid. And I was like, I answered the phone because I just had to tell you that your grandmother is dead. And, and I wanted to keep talking. But I knew better. So I just asked him if he was okay and that I loved him. I did tell him I loved him and that we could go back to not speaking again. And we both agreed that was for the best. But yeah, I miss him. Parenthood is painful. There are no promises. Your children may not turn out the way you want them to. And I do not like the person that my child became, but I still loved him. I could not have walked away from Paris. It was a really hard thing to finally do later on. But at that time, when he was 13 years old, kid needed help. Nobody was gonna love him as much as I do to get it for him. So even though I know it's for the best, and I know it's the healthiest and safest option, it still went against everything I believe to stop talking to him. Yeah, I miss him. I just don't miss what he does or who he is. And I experienced enough of that to know that no matter how bad I miss him, it's not worth it.
You remember where you stabbed her?
In the neck. I saw light in her eyes and I said, no more.
Still, I'm looking for remorse for what he did to his mother.
It's just like, this can't be true. This is not the Matthew that I knew.
On the evening of January 29, 2017, Quebec City was wrapped in its usual winter stillness. Snow clung to rooftops, softened the edges of streets, and muted the sound of passing cars. The St. Lawrence River moved slowly under a heavy sky, as if the entire city had settled into a quiet rhythm that nothing could disturb. Inside homes, families gathered after long days, and in places of worship, people prepared for the final prayers of the day. Nothing in that atmosphere suggested that within hours, the city would be shaken by one of the most devastating acts of violence in its modern history. In the Saint Foy district stood the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, a mosque that had become an important spiritual and community space for hundreds of families. For many, it was not only a place of prayer, but also a place of belonging. People came there after work, after school, after long commutes through winter roads, seeking warmth that was not only physical but also emotional. On that Sunday evening, worshippers gathered for Maghrib prayer, their voices soft, their movements familiar, their presence part of a routine that had repeated countless times without incident. Among them were fathers, students, workers, and elders. Some exchanged quiet greetings before prayer, others sat in contemplation, and some simply watched the snowfall through the windows before the call to prayer began. The world outside felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the mosque existed in a pocket of calm separated from the tension and noise of everyday life. At that same moment, outside this space of reflection, a young man was moving toward the building with intentions that would later be described as incomprehensible in their brutality. His name was Alexander Bissonnette, a 27-year-old resident of Quebec City whose life on the surface had been marked by quiet isolation. He was not a public figure, nor someone previously known for violent behavior in any official capacity. Yet beneath that outward normality, investigators would later attempt to trace a trajectory shaped by alienation, ideological exposure, and personal instability. What makes the story of that night so difficult to grasp is not only the violence itself, but the contrast between the peaceful environment inside the mosque and the internal world of the person approaching it. While worshippers were engaged in prayer, focused on ritual and community, Bissonnette was entering a mental state that would lead him to commit an irreversible act that would forever change the relationship between safety and vulnerability in public religious spaces across Canada. As the prayer concluded and people began to shift positions, preparing either to continue their evening or to return home, the atmosphere inside the mosque remained calm and familiar. Conversations resumed in low voices, shoes were gathered near entrances, and families began coordinating their departures. It was at this moment of transition, between stillness and movement, that the attack unfolded. The sudden intrusion of violence into this setting created an immediate rupture in reality. What had been a place of spiritual focus became, within seconds, a scene of confusion, fear, and survival. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet rhythm of prayer and replaced it with panic. People scattered in different directions, some attempting to shield others, some seeking exits they had used countless times, but now saw differently under the shock of the moment. Inside the mosque, time itself seemed to distort. Survivors later described the experience not as a continuous sequence, but as fragmented impressions. Sudden movement, sharp sound, the instinct to crouch or run, the confusion of not immediately understanding what was happening. In such moments, the mind struggles to process reality, and memory becomes a collection of disconnected fragments rather than a clear narrative. Outside, the winter night remained unchanged. Snow continued to fall, cars continued to pass on distant roads, and the city maintained its rhythm, unaware for a few critical minutes of the transformation occurring inside the building. That contrast between external normality and internal catastrophe would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the event. When the attack ended and emergency calls began to reach authorities, the scale of what had occurred slowly became clear. Police and paramedics arrived to a scene that required immediate coordination, not only to secure the area but also to care for the injured and account for those who had been inside. The mosque, once a place of calm gathering, was now a site of forensic investigation and collective grief. In the hours that followed, the identity of the attacker was confirmed, and investigators began reconstructing his path leading up to the event. Early findings suggested that Bissonnette had acted alone, but the deeper question of why he had chosen to carry out such an attack would require much longer examination. Authorities reviewed his background, online activity, and personal history, attempting to understand how his perceptions of the world had developed over time. At the same time, the community affected by the attack entered a period of shock and mourning. Families who had gathered for prayer found themselves separated by chaos and uncertainty. Some searched for loved ones in confusion. Others waited for news that would alter their lives permanently. The emotional weight of those moments extended far beyond the physical scene, embedding itself into memory in ways that would persist long after the immediate crisis ended. Public reaction across Quebec City and Canada was swift. Leaders from different religious and political backgrounds expressed solidarity with the victims and condemned the attack. Vigils were organized in the days that followed, where people from diverse communities came together to mourn and to affirm a shared commitment to coexistence. These gatherings were filled with silence, candles, and messages that attempted to express what words alone could not fully contain. Yet beneath the public expressions of unity, difficult questions began to emerge. How could such an attack occur in a place dedicated to peace? What factors contributed to the path that led an individual to target a religious community during prayer? And how could future harm be prevented without turning everyday life into a state of constant fear? These questions did not have immediate answers. Investigators continued their work, piecing together timelines and motivations, while sociologists and commentators began broader discussions about radicalization, social isolation, and the role of online environments in shaping beliefs. The case became not only a criminal investigation, but also a focal point for national reflection on tolerance, identity, and security. As days turned into weeks, the mosque gradually began to function again, though nothing felt entirely the same. Prayer resumed, but with a different emotional weight. People returned, but with awareness that their sense of safety had been altered. Healing began, but it was a process marked by both resilience and lingering grief. The story of that night remains anchored in the memory of Quebec City and Canada as a whole. It is not defined solely by the violence that occurred, but also by the response that followed, the mourning, the solidarity, and the ongoing effort to understand how such events can be prevented in the future. And at the center of that memory remains a reminder that even in spaces built for peace and reflection, vulnerability can exist in unexpected and devastating ways, reshaping not only the lives directly affected, but also the way an entire society understands coexistence in a diverse world. In the days following the attack at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, the city of Quebec began to wake up to a reality that felt unfamiliar, even surreal. The winter did not change. Snow still covered the streets, buses still ran on schedule, and daily routines resumed. But beneath that surface normality, something fundamental had shifted. The sense of security in shared public and religious spaces had been deeply shaken, and the community was left trying to understand how an ordinary evening of prayer could turn into a national tragedy. The Islamic Cultural Center itself, located in the Saint Foy district, had long been more than just a mosque. It functioned as a social anchor for many Muslim families in Quebec City, a place where religious practice intertwined with education, cultural exchange, and community support. People came not only for prayer, but also for connection, language classes, youth activities, and communal gatherings that made the building feel like a second home for many. Before the attack, it was widely seen as a peaceful and welcoming space, integrated into the broader fabric of the city. That perception changed in an instant on January 29, 2017, when Alexander Bissonnette entered the mosque and opened fire on worshippers during evening prayer. In the aftermath, the building transformed in public consciousness from a place of refuge into a symbol of vulnerability. Yet for those who knew it intimately, it remained both a place of spiritual comfort marked forever by an act of violence that occurred within its walls. As investigators secured the scene, their attention turned to reconstructing the sequence of events with precision. The goal was not only to understand what happened inside the mosque, but also to build a timeline of the attackers' movements before and after the incident. This required gathering surveillance footage, analyzing communication records, and interviewing witnesses who had been present during the attack or nearby at the time. What emerged was a fragmented but increasingly coherent picture. The attacker had acted alone, and there was no evidence of a coordinated group or external operational support. This detail was significant, as it placed the case within the category of lone actor violence, a phenomenon that had become an increasing focus of law enforcement and academic study in many countries. However, labeling the event in this way did not simplify its underlying causes. Instead, it raised further questions about how individuals reached the point of committing such irreversible acts. Within the mosque community, the immediate priority after the attack was mourning and recovery. Families gathered in grief, supporting one another through a shared sense of loss that was difficult to express in words. The victims were not abstract figures in a news report. They were fathers, sons, husbands, friends, and neighbors. Each life lost represented a ripple of absence that extended far beyond the immediate circle of those present in the mosque that evening. The emotional impact on survivors was profound. Many struggled with recurring memories of the event, sounds, movements, and sensations that returned unexpectedly in the days and weeks that followed. The experience of trauma did not follow a linear path. It came in waves, sometimes triggered by ordinary situations such as the sound of sudden noise or the sight of a crowded room. For some, returning to the mosque took time, while others found strength in returning sooner, reclaiming the space that had been violently disrupted. Outside the immediate community, the broader public response across Quebec City was marked by a mixture of shock, grief, and solidarity. Vigils were organized in public squares, churches, and community centers. Candles were lit, names of victims were read aloud, and moments of silence were observed. People from different religious and cultural backgrounds stood together, attempting to express unity in the face of violence that had targeted a specific community, but affected the entire city. Political leaders at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels issued statements condemning the attack and emphasizing the importance of protecting religious freedom and diversity. These responses were not only symbolic, they also signaled the beginning of renewed discussions about security in places of worship and the broader challenges of preventing hate-motivated violence. However, even as these discussions unfolded, there was a shared recognition that no policy response could fully undo the harm that had already been done. Investigators continued to examine the background of the attacker, trying to understand the factors that may have contributed to his actions. Early findings pointed toward a pattern of isolation and exposure to ideological content online. Though authorities were careful not to reduce the case to a single explanatory narrative, human behavior, especially in cases of extreme violence, rarely emerges from one cause alone. Instead, it is shaped by a convergence of personal experiences, psychological states, and environmental influences that interact over time. In the digital dimension of the investigation, attention turned to the online spaces the attacker had accessed. These spaces revealed a complex and often contradictory set of influences, reflecting broader challenges in the modern information environment. The Internet had become not only a tool for communication and knowledge, but also a space where fragmented ideologies could circulate and evolve without clear boundaries. Understanding how these influences intersected with personal vulnerability became an important part of the broader analysis of the case. Despite these efforts, many questions remained unanswered. Investigators could reconstruct actions, timelines, and behaviors, but the internal psychological transition from thought to action remained difficult to fully access. This gap between external evidence and internal motivation is one of the most challenging aspects of studying lone actor violence. It forces both law enforcement and researchers to acknowledge the limits of observation when trying to understand deeply personal and subjective experiences. Within the mosque community, rebuilding began gradually. The physical space was restored, prayer services resumed, and communal activities slowly returned. However, the process of emotional recovery did not follow a fixed schedule. For some, healing meant returning to familiar routines. For others, it meant redefining their relationship with the space entirely. The mosque remained both a place of faith and a site of memory, carrying layers of meaning that could not be separated. Over time, the attack became part of a broader national conversation in Canada about multiculturalism, coexistence, and the protection of minority communities. It also prompted reflection on how fear can disrupt the everyday experience of belonging, even in societies that value diversity and inclusion. These discussions were often complex and sometimes difficult, as they required balancing grief, justice, and the search for long-term solutions. Yet even as public discourse evolved, the personal dimension of the tragedy remained central. Each individual affected by the attack carried their own version of the event forward, shaped by their experiences, memories, and losses. These personal narratives became part of a collective memory that continues to evolve with time, ensuring that the event is not forgotten, but also not reduced to a single simplified story. In this way, the aftermath of the Quebec City mosque attack became not only a story of violence, but also a story of resilience, reflection, and ongoing telash to understand the conditions under which such violence can occur. And while the investigation provided answers to many factual questions, the deeper questions about meaning, prevention, and human behavior remain part of an ongoing conversation that continues far beyond the moment of the attack itself. In the heart of Quebec City, within a community that had slowly and steadily grown over decades, the Islamic Cultural Center stood as a place of belonging for many families who had built new lives in Canada. It was not just a building used for prayer, but a space where identity, faith, and everyday life intertwined. People came there carrying the weight of work, study, and family responsibilities, and for a short while each day, they found a sense of peace that felt separate from the pressures of the outside world. The individuals who gathered there on January 29, 2017, were not defined by headlines or statistics. They were fathers who worked long hours to support their children, students balancing education with part-time jobs, elderly men who had spent decades building their lives far from their countries of origin, and young people who saw the mosque as both a spiritual and social anchor. Their lives were ordinary in the most meaningful sense of the word, shaped by routine, responsibility, and community ties. Among those present that evening were people who had built deep connections within the mosque over years of regular attendance. Some arrived early, greeting familiar faces at the entrance, exchanging brief words about work, weather, or family. Others came quietly, taking a moment to sit before prayer, letting the noise of the outside world fade away. The mosque was a space where silence was not emptiness but comfort, and where presence itself carried meaning. For these individuals, the Islamic Cultural Center was not simply a religious institution. It was a continuation of home in a new country. Many had migrated to Canada seeking safety, opportunity, or stability, and over time, the mosque had become a place where their cultural and spiritual identities could exist without conflict. It provided structure in a foreign environment, familiarity in a changing world, and companionship in moments of loneliness. On that particular evening, as the winter cold settled over Quebec City, people gathered for the Maghrib prayer. The atmosphere inside the mosque was calm and familiar. Shoes were placed neatly near the entrance, coats were folded or hung, and conversations gradually quieted as worshippers prepared for prayer. The rhythm of movement inside the building was gentle and synchronized, shaped by routine and shared understanding. In those moments, nothing suggested that violence was near. The sense of safety was not naive. It was built over years of uninterrupted community life. The mosque had been a place where families felt comfortable bringing their children, where newcomers found guidance, and where elders offered wisdom shaped by experience. It was a space defined by trust. Yet within this setting of calm, the lives of those present were about to intersect with an event that would permanently alter them. The attacker, Alexander Bissonnette, entered this environment and disrupted not only physical safety, but also the emotional continuity of the space. In doing so, he transformed an ordinary evening of worship into a moment that would be remembered with pain and disbelief. For the victims, there was no preparation for what followed. The transition from prayer to chaos was immediate and disorienting. The familiar environment of the mosque, its carpets, walls, and lighting, became the backdrop for a reality that no one inside could fully comprehend as it unfolded. In such moments, the human mind often struggles to process the contradiction between expectation and experience. Survivors later described how time seemed to break apart during the event. The flow of seconds lost coherence, replaced by fragmented impressions. Movement across the room, sudden noise, confusion about direction, and instinctive reactions driven more by survival than conscious thought. These fragments would later become part of their memory, but in the moment itself, there was no narrative, only reaction. The victim's experiences cannot be reduced to a single description because each individual perceived the event differently depending on their position, awareness, and proximity to the unfolding violence. Some were closer to the entrance, others deeper inside the prayer hall. Some reacted immediately, while others hesitated, unable to interpret what was happening in real time. This diversity of experience is a reminder that even shared events are never experienced in identical ways. What united all of them, however, was the sudden collapse of predictability. The mosque, which had always represented safety and routine, became a space where normal assumptions no longer applied. That collapse is one of the most psychologically significant aspects of such events. The moment when a familiar environment is transformed into something unrecognizable. Outside the mosque, the city of Quebec continued its winter night unaware of the precise nature of what was happening inside. Cars moved along snow-covered roads, streetlights cast long shadows on icy sidewalks, and homes remained warm and quiet. This contrast between external normality and internal catastrophe is a recurring feature in many violent incidents, but it is especially striking in cases where the location is a place of worship. For the community, the victims were not abstract figures. They were individuals whose daily presence shaped the rhythm of communal life. Some were known for their regular participation in prayers, others for their involvement in community events, and others simply as familiar faces seen in passing. Their absence created immediate emotional voids that extended beyond the mosque into homes, workplaces, and social circles. In the aftermath, as news of the attack spread, families and friends began searching for information. Phones rang continuously, messages were exchanged in confusion and fear, and people gathered in small groups trying to confirm who was safe and who was not. These early moments after the event were marked by uncertainty, a state where hope and grief existed side by side. As identities of the victims were confirmed, each name carried with it a deeper story that extended beyond the moment of violence. They were individuals with histories, aspirations, and relationships. Some had recently arrived in Canada, still adjusting to a new life, while others had spent decades contributing to the growth of their community. Their lives were interconnected in ways that only became fully visible after their loss. The emotional impact on the community was profound. Grief was not experienced only individually but collectively, as shared mourning became part of the healing process. People gathered not only to pray but also to support one another, to sit in silence together, and to begin the difficult process of understanding what could not be easily understood. Even in the early stages of recovery, one thing became clear. The victims were remembered not only for how their lives ended, but for how they lived. Their presence in the community had been meaningful, and that meaning continued to resonate long after the event itself. In this way, the victim's story is not defined solely by tragedy, but also by the continuity of human connection that existed before it. Their lives were shaped by relationships, faith, and daily routines that gave structure to their existence. And while the violence of that night interrupted those lives, it did not erase the significance of what came before. This is why the memory of the victims remains central to understanding the impact of the Quebec City mosque attack. It is not only a story about an act of violence, but also a story about people whose lives mattered deeply to those around them, and whose absence continues to be felt within a community that still carries both grief and resilience. On the evening of January 29, 2017, as the winter darkness settled fully over Quebec City, the Islamic Cultural Center became the quiet center of a routine that had repeated itself countless times before. Inside the prayer hall, worshippers stood shoulder to shoulder, their movements synchronized in the familiar rhythm of Maghrib prayer. The air was calm, filled only with the soft sounds of footsteps on carpet and the low murmur of recitation. Nothing in that moment suggested that within minutes, this space of devotion would be shattered by an act of irreversible violence. The transition from peace to chaos did not arrive gradually. It arrived abruptly, without warning, without negotiation, and without time for understanding. The attacker, Alexander Bissonnette, entered the building armed and moved into a space where people were still in prayer, or just beginning to rise from it. The contrast between intention and reality inside that room would define every second that followed. At first, there was confusion rather than comprehension. In moments like these, the human mind often resists accepting what is happening, searching for explanations that fit familiar patterns. A loud sound might be mistaken for something accidental, a sudden movement interpreted as misunderstanding. But reality quickly asserted itself, breaking through any attempt to normalize the situation. The sound of gunfire replaced silence, and the structure of the evening collapsed into disorder. Inside the mosque, the reaction was immediate and instinctive. Some people dropped to the ground, others moved toward exits, while others froze in place, unable to process the sudden shift in environment. Prayer, which had moments earlier structured their attention and movement, was replaced by survival instinct. The space itself, once defined by order and ritual, became unpredictable and fragmented. The attacker moved through the prayer hall with deliberate intent, targeting individuals in a space where movement was already constrained by proximity and layout. The architecture of the mosque, designed for communal worship and closeness, now became part of the intensity of the situation. Narrow passages, rows of worshippers, and limited exits all contributed to the difficulty of escape in those critical moments. Survivors later described how time felt distorted during the attack. Seconds seemed stretched and disconnected, as if the normal flow of time had broken apart. In such situations, memory does not record events as a continuous sequence but rather as fragments. The sound of movement, the instinct to crouch, the confusion of direction, the awareness of others reacting simultaneously. These fragments would later form the basis of testimony, but in the moment itself, there was no coherent narrative, only survival. The emotional shock of the attack was intensified by its location. A mosque is not simply a public building. It is a space associated with safety, reflection, and spiritual grounding. The violation of that expectation creates a psychological rupture that extends beyond physical harm. It changes how individuals perceive not only the space itself, but also the broader idea of safety in places of worship. Outside the building, the winter night of Quebec City remained unchanged. Snow continued to fall steadily, covering sidewalks and cars, while streetlights cast a pale glow over quiet residential streets. This contrast between external calm and internal catastrophe is one of the most striking aspects of the event. Life outside did not immediately reflect the intensity of what was unfolding inside, creating a temporal disconnect between two realities occurring simultaneously. When emergency calls were made, the response began quickly. Police units and paramedics were dispatched to the scene, initially without full understanding of the scale of the situation. As they arrived, the urgency became clear. The area around the mosque was secured, and responders began the difficult task of entering a space where violence had only just occurred. Their role was not only to neutralize any ongoing threat, but also to provide immediate assistance to those inside. Inside, survivors attempted to help one another amid confusion and fear. Some assisted those who were injured, while others tried to guide people toward exits or safer areas within the building. In moments of crisis, human behavior often reveals both vulnerability and solidarity simultaneously. Even in the midst of panic, acts of care and assistance emerge instinctively. As the situation stabilized, attention shifted toward understanding what had happened. The early stages of investigation focused on establishing a timeline. When the attacker entered, how long the incident lasted, and how he moved through the space. These details would later become essential for reconstructing the full sequence of events, but at that moment, they were still unclear fragments of a rapidly unfolding picture. The presence of Alexander Bissonnette as the sole identified actor in the event became a central focus of early investigation. Authorities began gathering evidence from surveillance systems, witness accounts, and physical traces left at the scene. The goal was not only to identify responsibility, but also to ensure that no additional threat remained. As responders worked, the emotional weight of the scene became increasingly apparent. This was not simply a crime scene. It was a place of worship transformed into a site of trauma. The psychological impact on first responders themselves is often an overlooked dimension of such events. They are required to operate in environments where human suffering is immediate and visible, while maintaining professional focus on safety and procedure. In the hours following the attack, information began to spread across the city and then across the country. News outlets reported breaking details, and social media became a space where shock, grief, and disbelief were expressed in real time. For many who were not directly involved, the event still felt deeply personal, as it challenged assumptions about safety and coexistence in everyday spaces. As the immediate crisis passed, the focus gradually shifted toward recovery and understanding. But even in those early hours, it was clear that the impact of the attack would extend far beyond the physical damage. It had disrupted a sense of trust that had existed within the community, particularly within the space of the mosque itself. The events of that night would later be analyzed from many perspectives: security, psychology, sociology, and public policy. But in the immediate aftermath, what remained most present was the human experience of sudden disruption. A normal evening had been transformed into something unimaginable, and the process of making sense of that transformation had only just begun. When emergency responders arrived at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec on the night of January 29, 2017, they were stepping into a scene that was still unstable in its emotional weight, even after the immediate violence had ended. The snow outside continued to fall gently, covering police vehicles and flashing lights in a soft white layer that contrasted sharply with the urgency inside the building. What awaited them was not only a crime scene, but a fractured space of worship where fear, confusion, and grief had converged in a matter of minutes. Inside, the prayer hall had transformed into a landscape of disorder. Objects that once held quiet meaning, shoes aligned at the entrance, prayer rugs arranged in rows, personal belongings left behind in haste, now appeared as silent witnesses to the chaos that had just unfolded. The air carried a heaviness that cannot be measured in physical terms, shaped instead by shock and the immediate aftermath of violence. Survivors were being guided to safety, some in silence, others in tears, many still struggling to understand what they had just experienced. The first priority for responders was to secure the building. Even though the attacker, Alexander Bissonnette, was no longer actively posing a threat inside the mosque, standard procedure required a careful and systematic sweep of the premises. Every room, corridor, and possible exit had to be checked to ensure there were no additional dangers. This process, though methodical, unfolded within an environment charged with emotional tension. As police officers moved through the mosque, they encountered the physical evidence of what had occurred only moments earlier. The arrangement of space itself told a story, where people had been gathered, where movement had been interrupted, and where panic had forced sudden decisions. Investigators later described how scenes like this require not only technical observation, but also emotional control, as they are confronted with the immediate aftermath of human suffering. Outside the building, ambulances were stationed to receive the injured and provide triage support. Medical personnel worked quickly but carefully, assessing injuries, offering stabilization, and preparing individuals for transport to hospitals across Quebec City. For families who had gathered nearby, every arrival outside the mosque door carried uncertainty. Each moment brought the question of who had survived and who had not, a question that could only be answered gradually, and often painfully. Inside the mosque, survivors were guided into designated areas where they could sit, receive blankets, and begin the slow process of regaining awareness of their surroundings. Many were in a state of emotional shock, their responses delayed or fragmented. In such conditions, the mind often struggles to immediately process trauma. Some individuals spoke very little, while others repeated questions or attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events out loud, as if speaking could help restore order to memory. The identification of victims began as part of a carefully managed process. Authorities worked to confirm identities through documentation, witness testimony, and family contacts. This stage of investigation is often one of the most emotionally difficult, as it transforms abstract numbers into individual human lives. Each confirmation carried a weight that extended far beyond administrative procedure, marking a permanent shift in the lives of families and communities. At the same time, investigators began documenting the physical environment in detail. Every area of the mosque was photographed, mapped, and analyzed. The goal was to preserve the integrity of the scene for later reconstruction, ensuring that the sequence of events could be understood with as much accuracy as possible. This process required balancing urgency with precision, as time and environmental conditions can gradually alter evidence. The presence of Alexander Bissonnette as the central figure in the investigation became more defined during these early hours. Evidence collected at the scene, combined with surveillance footage and witness accounts, allowed investigators to begin reconstructing his movements with increasing clarity. However, understanding actions did not immediately translate into understanding motivations, a distinction that would remain central throughout the investigation. As dawn approached, the mosque had become a controlled perimeter surrounded by police tape, emergency vehicles, and media presence. The snowfall had softened the exterior scene, but inside, the weight of what had happened remained unchanged. The contrast between the quiet winter morning outside and the emotional aftermath inside created a stark reminder of how quickly reality can shift. Families gathered in nearby locations, waiting for updates. Community leaders and volunteers organized support networks to assist those affected, providing food, information, and emotional support. In moments like these, community structures become essential not only for logistical coordination, but also for emotional stabilization. The shared experience of uncertainty creates a collective space where grief begins to take shape. As information slowly became available, the broader public began to understand the scale of what had occurred. News reports confirmed fatalities and injuries, and the identity of the location became widely known. For many across Canada, the realization that a place of worship had been targeted during prayer added a layer of emotional intensity to the event that extended beyond geographic boundaries. In the hours following the attack, the mosque itself remained closed to the public as investigators completed initial documentation. The building, which normally functioned as a place of gathering and continuity, had been temporarily transformed into a site of forensic analysis. Every surface, every room, and every pathway was part of a larger effort to understand how the event had unfolded. Even in this controlled environment, the emotional presence of what had happened remained unavoidable. Investigators, responders, and community members moving through the space were constantly aware that they were walking through a moment in time that had altered many lives permanently. This awareness often shapes how such scenes are remembered long after the technical investigation concludes. As the immediate phase of evidence collection continued, attention also began to turn toward the broader context of the attacker's background and behavior leading up to the incident. While this aspect of the investigation would take more time to fully develop, early indications suggested a pattern of isolation and exposure to ideological content online. However, authorities emphasized caution in drawing conclusions too quickly, recognizing the complexity involved in understanding such cases. By the end of the first day, the Islamic Cultural Center stood at the center of national attention. What had begun as an ordinary evening of prayer had become a defining moment in Canadian public consciousness. Yet within the mosque community itself, the focus was not on national narratives, but on immediate human realities: survival, loss, and the beginning of an uncertain path toward healing. The discovery phase of the investigation was not only about uncovering facts. It was also about confronting the emotional reality of what had occurred. Every piece of evidence carried with it a human dimension, and every procedural step was intertwined with the lives of those affected. In this way, the scene inside the mosque became both a site of forensic inquiry and a space of collective mourning, marking the beginning of a long process of understanding that would extend far beyond the first hours of response. In the days following the initial response to the attack at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, the investigation entered a more structured and methodical phase. What had begun as an urgent emergency response gradually shifted into a complex reconstruction of events, requiring coordination between forensic specialists, intelligence analysts, and law enforcement agencies. The mosque, once a place of worship and community gathering, had become the central point of a national investigation, and every detail within it was now treated as a piece of evidence in a larger attempt to understand what had occurred. The early findings confirmed a crucial fact. The attacker, Alexander Bissonnette, had acted alone. There was no immediate evidence of a coordinated group physically present at the scene, nor indications of a traditional organized network directing the operation in real time. This classification as a lone actor attack did not simplify the case. Rather, it shifted the focus of the investigation toward understanding individual motivation, behavioral development, and ideological influence over time. Detectives began by constructing a detailed timeline of Bissonnette's movements before the attack. Surveillance footage from nearby streets, traffic cameras, and the mosque surroundings were analyzed frame by frame. These visual records helped establish his arrival route, timing, and behavior leading up to the moment he entered the building. Each piece of footage added another layer to a gradually forming narrative, though gaps in information still required careful interpretation. At the same time, investigators conducted interviews with individuals who may have had contact with him in the days, weeks, and months prior to the attack. These interviews did not initially reveal any direct warnings or explicit threats, but they did contribute to a broader picture of a person increasingly isolated from social interaction. Witnesses described limited communication, withdrawal from social environments, and a growing detachment from routine engagement with others. Digital forensics became one of the most important components of the investigation. Authorities examined his online activity, including browsing history, forum participation, and consumption of media content. In the modern landscape of criminal investigations, digital behavior often provides critical insight into the evolution of thought processes that are not visible in physical interactions. In this case, the digital trail suggested exposure to ideological narratives that reinforce feelings of alienation and grievance, although investigators were careful to distinguish between exposure and direct causation. The challenge in this phase of the investigation was not the lack of data, but the difficulty of interpreting it without oversimplification. Human behavior, particularly in cases involving extreme violence, rarely follows a linear path. Investigators had to avoid drawing premature conclusions that could reduce a complex psychological and social process into a single explanatory factor. Instead, they worked to map patterns of behavior over time, identifying shifts in emotional state, communication habits, and external influences. Inside the community affected by the attack, the investigation was unfolding alongside a separate process of emotional recovery. Families of victims were in close contact with authorities, providing statements, confirming identities, and seeking clarity about the events that had led to the loss of their loved ones. These interactions were often emotionally difficult, as factual reconstruction intersected with personal grief. The mosque itself remained under controlled access during much of this period. Forensic teams continued to examine the interior in detail, documenting spatial arrangements, entry points, and trajectories of movement within the building. Each measurement and observation contributed to a broader reconstruction of how the attacker moved through the space, and how individuals inside responded under extreme pressure. One of the key findings confirmed during this stage was the speed and intensity of the attack. The entire sequence unfolded in a very short period of time, leaving little opportunity for organized resistance or structured response from those inside. This temporal compression became an important element in understanding both the physical and psychological dimensions of the event. As investigators refined the timeline, attention also turned to the broader context of radicalization pathways in contemporary society. While avoiding definitive labels in the early stages, analysts began examining how individuals in isolated conditions might encounter and internalize extreme ideological content through online environments. The case of Alexander Bissonnette became part of a wider discussion about how digital spaces can function as amplifiers for fragmented worldviews. However, law enforcement officials repeatedly emphasized that understanding influence does not mean establishing a single cause. The investigation was careful to avoid reducing the complexity of the event to a simple narrative of online indoctrination or psychological instability. Instead, it recognized that such incidents often emerge from overlapping conditions that develop over extended periods of time. During this phase, coordination between different agencies became essential. Local police worked alongside provincial and federal authorities, sharing data, synchronizing timelines, and ensuring that all evidence was properly cataloged and preserved. This multi-layered approach reflected the seriousness of the case and the need for comprehensive analysis across multiple domains of expertise. At the same time, the community continued to process the emotional aftermath. Support networks expanded to include counselors, religious leaders, and volunteers who helped families navigate grief and uncertainty. These efforts were not separate from the investigation. They were parallel responses to the same event, addressing the human consequences while the technical analysis proceeded. Public interest in the case remained high, with media coverage focusing on both the factual developments and the broader implications of the attack. Questions about security in places of worship, social integration, and the prevention of radical violence became central themes in national discourse. Yet within the community itself, the focus remained on remembrance, healing, and honoring those who had been lost. As more information emerged, the investigation gradually moved from immediate reconstruction toward deeper analysis of behavioral patterns. The goal was not only to understand what happened, but to identify warning signs that might be relevant in future prevention efforts. This preventive dimension is a critical aspect of modern investigative practice, particularly in cases involving lone actor violence. Despite these efforts, significant uncertainties remained. While the external sequence of events was becoming clearer, the internal psychological progression leading up to the attack remained partially inaccessible. Investigators could observe behavior, but not fully reconstruct intention. This gap between observable data and internal experience is one of the enduring challenges in cases of this nature. By the end of this phase, the case had evolved from an emergency response into a complex multidisciplinary investigation. It involved not only law enforcement, but also psychologists, sociologists, digital analysts, and community stakeholders. Each contributed a different perspective, but none alone could fully explain the entirety of the event. The attack carried out by Alexander Bissonnette thus became more than a criminal case. It became a focal point for examining how individual trajectories intersect with broader social and technological environments. And while the investigation continued to move forward, it was increasingly clear that the answers would not come from a single source, but from the careful integration of many fragmented pieces of evidence. In this way, the investigation phase did not simply aim to resolve a case. It also reflected a broader effort to understand vulnerability, complexity, and the limits of prediction in a modern world where the boundaries between physical and digital influence are constantly shifting. As the investigation into the Quebec City mosque attack progressed beyond its initial stages, a gradual but significant shift began to take place. The focus was no longer solely on reconstructing the sequence of events, but on understanding the deeper context that allowed such an act of violence to emerge. By this point, investigators, analysts, and community stakeholders were working within a shared framework that aimed not only to explain what happened, but to identify what might have contributed to it. The figure at the center of the case, Alexander Bissonnette, remained under intensive examination by law enforcement and psychological experts. His actions had already been established with relative clarity through forensic evidence, surveillance records, and witness testimony. However, the central challenge now lay in understanding the internal progression that preceded those actions. This stage of the investigation required moving beyond physical evidence into behavioral patterns, cognitive development, and environmental influences. One of the key breakthroughs in this phase came from the integration of digital forensics with behavioral analysis. Investigators were able to map more precisely the timeline of his online activity, identifying patterns of repeated exposure to content that reinforce certain narratives about identity, belonging, and conflict. While authorities remained cautious about assigning direct causation, The consistency of these patterns provided important context for understanding the ideological environment in which he had been operating. At the same time, psychological assessments based on available records and post-incident analysis began to outline a profile characterized by isolation, emotional withdrawal, and a growing disconnection from social structures. Experts involved in the case emphasized that these traits alone are not predictive of violence, but when combined with other factors, they can contribute to a heightened risk environment. The key insight was not any single characteristic, but the interaction between multiple vulnerabilities over time. A major turning point in the investigation occurred when analysts began to reconstruct not just what Bissonnette consumed online, but how he may have interpreted and internalized that information. This distinction proved critical. Exposure to ideological content does not automatically result in behavioral change. Rather, it is the personal interpretation of that content within an existing psychological framework that shapes potential outcomes. This nuance became central to the investigative narrative. Parallel to the behavioral analysis, law enforcement continued refining the timeline leading up to the attack. The hours, days, and weeks before January 29, 2017, were examined in increasing detail. Investigators looked for shifts in routine, changes in communication patterns, and any indicators of escalation. While some irregularities were identified, none formed a clear or consistent warning pattern that could have definitively predicted the event. This absence of a clear predictive signal became one of the most significant findings of the case. It highlighted a fundamental limitation in the prevention of lone actor violence: the difficulty of distinguishing between private internal struggle and escalating external threat. In many cases, individuals who later commit violent acts do not exhibit behaviors that are easily identifiable as dangerous within conventional monitoring systems. As the investigative narrative deepened, attention also turned to the broader societal context in which the attack occurred. Quebec City, like many urban centers, had experienced ongoing conversations about cultural diversity, integration, and social cohesion. These discussions formed part of the backdrop against which individual experiences of isolation or alienation could develop. However, investigators were careful not to conflate societal conditions with direct causation, instead viewing them as part of a complex and indirect environment. Within this framework, the case of Alexander Bissonnette became increasingly important for understanding the interaction between individual psychology and broader cultural narratives. His trajectory was analyzed not as a product of a single influence, but as the result of multiple intersecting factors that accumulated over time without clear visibility to those around him. During this phase, collaboration between different disciplines became essential. Criminal investigators worked alongside psychologists, sociologists, and digital analysts, each contributing a distinct perspective. This multidisciplinary approach allowed for a more nuanced interpretation of evidence, moving away from linear explanations toward a more layered understanding of behavioral development. At the same time, the community affected by the attack continued its own process of recovery. Families of victims remained in close contact with support services, and the mosque gradually resumed its role as a place of worship and gathering. However, the emotional landscape had changed permanently. The space now carried a dual meaning. It remained a center of faith and community, but also a site of collective memory and trauma. This duality became an important aspect of the broader narrative. Places affected by violence often exist in a state of layered meaning, where ordinary activity continues alongside persistent remembrance of past events. For those who returned to the mosque, this meant navigating both continuity and memory in the same physical space. As the investigation moved toward its later stages, authorities began consolidating findings into a coherent analytical framework. This included behavioral timelines, digital activity mapping, psychological interpretation, and environmental context. The goal was not to simplify the case, but to integrate its complexity into a structured understanding that could inform future prevention efforts. One of the most significant conclusions emerging from this phase was the recognition that no single factor could fully explain the attack. Instead, it was the convergence of multiple elements: social isolation, psychological vulnerability, exposure to ideological narratives, and personal interpretation, that created conditions under which the act became possible. This conclusion did not provide a simple answer, but it offered a more realistic understanding of how such events can develop. Importantly, investigators emphasized that this framework was not predictive in a deterministic sense. It could not be used to identify individuals who would definitively commit violence. Rather, it served as an analytical tool to understand patterns after the fact, with the hope of improving awareness and response strategies in the future. Throughout this process, the presence of Alexander Bissonnette remained central to the narrative, not as a symbol, but as a case study through which broader questions could be examined. His actions, while unique in their specific circumstances, became part of a wider body of research into the nature of isolated violent behavior in modern societies. As the investigation approached its final analytical stages, it became clear that the most valuable outcome was not a singular explanation, but a deeper understanding of complexity itself. The case demonstrated that modern acts of violence often emerge from intersections that are difficult to detect in real time, and even harder to interpret retrospectively without oversimplification. In this way, the breakthrough in the case was not a single piece of evidence or a dramatic revelation, but the gradual construction of a multidimensional understanding. It was a shift from asking what caused this to asking how do multiple conditions interact over time to make such an event possible. This shift marked a turning point not only in the investigation, but also in how similar cases would be approached in the future. As the investigation into the Quebec City mosque attack gradually transitioned from evidence collection to legal proceedings, the focus of the case shifted once again. What had been a scene of chaos, then a subject of forensic reconstruction and behavioral analysis, now entered the structured and formal environment of the judicial system. The emotional weight of the events of January 29, 2017, did not diminish with time, but it was now processed through the language of law, procedure, and evidence. The individual at the center of the proceedings, Alexander Bissonnette, was formally charged and brought before the court to face the consequences of the actions that had shocked Quebec City and the entire country. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was markedly different from the scenes of the investigation and emergency response. Here, everything was structured, deliberate, and contained within strict procedural boundaries. Yet beneath that structure, the emotional reality of the case remained deeply present. Families of the victims attended the proceedings, sitting in silence as the legal process unfolded. For many of them, the courtroom was not just a place of justice, but also a place of memory. Every statement, every piece of evidence, and every procedural step carried emotional weight. The law demanded order and clarity, but grief does not always follow the same structure. The prosecution presented a detailed reconstruction of the events, relying on forensic evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and digital records. The sequence of actions carried out by Bissonnette was laid out in precise detail, showing how the attack unfolded inside the Islamic Cultural Center. Each element of evidence was carefully introduced to establish not only what had happened, but also the deliberate nature of the actions taken. Throughout the proceedings, the court maintained a focus on factual clarity. The goal was not only to determine responsibility, but also to ensure that the legal narrative was supported by verifiable evidence. In cases involving mass violence, the judicial system must balance the emotional impact of the crime with the requirement for procedural fairness and accuracy. The defense, meanwhile, engaged with questions related to psychological state, intent, and legal interpretation. While the factual basis of the events was not in dispute, the legal framing of responsibility required careful examination of mental and emotional factors at the time of the attack. This aspect of the trial highlighted the complexity of translating human behavior into legal categories. As the proceedings continued, the courtroom became a space where two realities coexisted: the structured language of law and the unstructured reality of human suffering. Survivors and family members listened as details of the attack were presented in clinical terms. Yet for them, those details were inseparable from lived experience. This tension between legal abstraction and personal memory is a defining feature of trials involving mass violence. The case of Alexander Bissonnette also raised broader legal and societal questions. One of the central issues was how the justice system should classify and respond to acts of extreme violence motivated by complex personal and ideological factors. The court was required to determine not only guilt, but also the appropriate severity of sentencing in a context where the scale of harm was profound and irreversible. Victim impact statements played a significant role during the sentencing phase. Families and survivors described the lasting emotional, psychological, and social consequences of the attack. These statements were not simply descriptions of loss. They were expressions of ongoing reality. The absence of loved ones, the disruption of daily life, and the persistent presence of trauma were all articulated in deeply personal terms. For those present in the courtroom, these statements served as a reminder that the legal process, while essential, cannot fully encapsulate the depth of human suffering. The law operates within defined boundaries, but grief extends beyond those boundaries into every aspect of life. As the trial progressed, media attention remained intense. The case had already become a focal point in national discussions about violence, security, and social cohesion in Canada. However, within the courtroom, the emphasis remained on evidence and legal reasoning. Judges, lawyers, and jurors were required to navigate a space where emotional weight was present, but could not determine legal outcomes. The final judgment reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the deliberate nature of the actions proven in court. The sentence imposed on Alexander Bissonnette was intended to reflect both the scale of harm and the principles of Canadian criminal law. The decision was delivered in a formal setting, but its impact extended far beyond the courtroom walls. For the families of the victims, the sentencing did not mark the end of grief, but rather the conclusion of one phase of a longer process. Justice, in legal terms, had been served, but emotional healing remained an ongoing journey. The distinction between legal closure and personal closure became evident in the reactions that followed the verdict. Outside the courthouse, public responses were mixed with reflection and solemnity. Some saw the sentence as a necessary affirmation of accountability, while others focused on the broader questions that the case had raised about prevention and societal responsibility. The trial had provided answers to legal questions, but many social and psychological questions remained open. Within academic and policy circles, the case became a reference point for discussions about how legal systems handle acts of mass violence. It highlighted the importance of victim participation, the challenges of addressing psychological factors in legal contexts, and the limitations of punishment as a means of addressing underlying causes. At the same time, the Islamic Cultural Center gradually returned to its role as a place of worship and community life. Yet its identity had been permanently altered. It remained a functioning mosque, but it also carried the memory of what had occurred within its walls. For those who returned, each prayer carried both continuity and remembrance. The presence of Alexander Bissonnette in public discourse did not end with the trial. Instead, his case continued to be studied in legal, psychological, and sociological contexts, not as a figure of interest in isolation, but as part of broader efforts to understand how such events can occur within modern societies. As the courtroom proceedings concluded, what remained was not a sense of finality, but a recognition of complexity. The legal system had fulfilled its role in determining responsibility and delivering judgment, but the deeper questions surrounding prevention, understanding, and human behavior remained part of an ongoing societal conversation. In this way, the trial became not an endpoint, but a transition, moving the case from the realm of investigation and emergency response into the lasting domain of memory, law, and public reflection. After the conclusion of the trial, the Quebec City mosque attack slowly shifted from an active legal case into a permanent part of collective memory. What had once been a rapidly unfolding sequence of violence, investigation, and courtroom proceedings now settled into something different. A historical reference point that continued to shape conversations about safety, identity, and coexistence in Canada. The formal processes of justice had ended, but the emotional and societal processes continued in quieter, more enduring ways. The individual at the center of the case, Alexander Bissonnette, was no longer present in public space except through legal records, media archives, and academic discussions. His actions remained fixed in time, but their interpretation continued to evolve. In criminology, sociology, and psychology, The case became a subject of study not for its sensational aspects, but for the difficult questions it raised about how violence emerges in modern societies. In Quebec City, and particularly within the Islamic Cultural Center, life gradually resumed its rhythms. The mosque reopened fully, and prayer services returned to their normal schedule. Children attended classes, families gathered again, and community events slowly re-established their presence. Yet the space itself had changed in meaning. It remained a place of worship, but it also carried a layered memory that could not be separated from its history. For many members of the community, returning to the mosque was both an act of continuity and an act of courage. Some returned quickly, seeking to reclaim a space that had been disrupted by violence. Others took more time, needing distance before they could re-enter the building. There was no single way to process what had happened, and no uniform timeline for healing. Each person carried their own relationship with memory, grief, and resilience. Across Canada, the attack became part of a broader national reflection on multiculturalism, religious freedom, and the protection of minority communities. It was discussed in schools, policy forums, and academic research. The event was not treated as an isolated incident, but as part of a wider conversation about how societies respond to hatred and violence when it emerges in public spaces. Annual commemorations became an important part of this process. Vigils and memorials were held in Quebec City and elsewhere, where people gathered to remember the victims and to reaffirm commitments to inclusion and respect. These events were often marked by silence, speeches, and the reading of names. While symbolic, they also served a practical role in maintaining collective awareness over time. The legacy of the attack also influenced public policy. Discussions about security in places of worship became more prominent, as did conversations about early intervention, mental health support, and the monitoring of online radicalization pathways. However, policymakers consistently faced the challenge of balancing prevention with civil liberties, recognizing that overly broad measures could create new social tensions. In academic research, the case continued to be analyzed from multiple perspectives. Psychologists examined patterns of isolation and cognitive distortion. Sociologists studied the broader social conditions that can contribute to alienation. Legal scholars reflected on how the justice system handles mass violence cases. In each discipline, the attack served as a complex case study rather than a simple example. Yet despite this analytical attention, experts repeatedly emphasized that no single framework could fully explain what had occurred. The case resisted reduction. It could be described, categorized, and contextualized, but never fully contained within one explanation. This limitation itself became an important lesson for researchers studying similar events. Within the Islamic Cultural Center, daily life became a form of quiet resilience. The building continued to function as a mosque, school, and community space. Conversations returned to ordinary topics: family, work, education, and faith. But the memory of the attack remained present in subtle ways. It was not always spoken about directly, but it influenced how people experienced the space and each other. For younger generations who later entered the community, the attack became part of inherited memory. They learned about it through family stories, community discussions, and commemorations. In this way, the event extended beyond those who directly experienced it, becoming part of a shared historical consciousness that shaped identity and awareness. The figure of Alexander Bissonnette remained present in public discourse, but increasingly within academic and institutional contexts rather than immediate public debate. His case was referenced in studies of lone actor violence, online influence, and the psychology of isolation. These discussions aim not to sensationalize, but to understand patterns that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. However, even with extensive analysis, the central tension of the case remained unresolved: the gap between understanding and prevention. While researchers could identify contributing factors and risk environments, translating that knowledge into reliable prediction or intervention remained extremely difficult. This limitation continues to shape how societies think about prevention strategies in complex human behavior. On a societal level, the attack contributed to a broader reaffirmation of values related to inclusion and coexistence. Public discourse increasingly emphasized the importance of protecting spaces where diversity could be expressed safely. Yet this emphasis also came with recognition that such protection requires ongoing effort rather than one-time solutions. Memorial practices evolved over time. What began as immediate expressions of grief transformed into structured annual remembrance. These moments served not only to honor the victims, but also to reinforce collective awareness of the consequences of violence. Over time, they became part of the civic calendar, embedded in the rhythm of public life. In the long-term perspective, the Quebec City mosque attack became a case that encapsulated multiple dimensions of modern society. The vulnerability of public spaces, the complexities of identity and belonging, the challenges of interpreting online influence, and the limits of institutional prevention. It was not defined by a single narrative, but by the interaction of many overlapping ones. Ultimately, the story does not end in a traditional sense. It remains open in its implications, continuing to influence how communities, institutions, and individuals think about safety, memory, and coexistence. The events of that winter night in 2017 did not only belong to the past, they became part of an ongoing dialogue about how societies respond to violence, and how they choose to remember those affected by it. And at the center of that memory remains a simple but enduring truth. Behind every analysis, every court ruling, and every public discussion are real human lives. Lives that continue to shape the meaning of what happened long after the final page of the official record has closed. After the final court decisions had been delivered, and the public attention slowly shifted toward other global events, the Quebec City mosque attack did not disappear. It simply changed form. It moved from breaking news to memory, from urgent investigation to long-term reflection, from courtroom transcripts to something far more difficult to measure. The way a society carries trauma forward. The case of Alexander Bissonnette became one of those rare events that never fully leaves public consciousness. It is referenced in legal studies, cited in psychological research, and recalled in political discussions about hate-motivated violence. But within the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, the meaning of the event is not academic. It is lived. On ordinary days, the mosque looks like what it has always been intended to be: a place of worship, learning, and community. Shoes are placed neatly at the entrance. Conversations in different languages overlap softly in the hallways. Children run briefly before prayer time, and elders sit in familiar corners. Life continues, and that continuation itself becomes a quiet statement against what happened there. Yet continuity does not mean erasure. The memory of the attack is embedded in the building, not physically visible in most places, but present in the awareness of those who know its history. For some, it is a place they had to return to. For others, it is a place they never left. And for younger members of the community, it is a story inherited rather than personally experienced, passed down through careful explanation and remembrance. One of the most striking long-term effects of the attack is how it reshaped the concept of safety in everyday religious practice. Before the incident, many worshippers did not consciously think about threat while entering the mosque. Afterward, even as routines resumed, awareness changed. Doors, exits, unfamiliar faces. All of these details became part of a subtle mental landscape that did not exist in the same way before. This shift is not unique to Quebec City. It reflects a broader global pattern in which acts of public violence alter how communities perceive ordinary spaces. A place of worship, a school, a concert hall. These are no longer viewed purely through their intended function, but also through the lens of possibility, however unlikely, of disruption. In policy discussions, the attack contributed to ongoing debates in Canada about how to protect religious and cultural institutions without turning them into fortified spaces. Governments and community organizations explored funding for security improvements, awareness programs, and emergency preparedness training. But these measures raised a difficult question. How do you preserve openness while increasing protection? There is no simple answer. Too much security can change the nature of a space, making it feel less like a community center and more like a controlled perimeter. Too little leaves vulnerability. The balance between these two realities continues to be negotiated in practical and symbolic terms. Academically, the case is often discussed not only as an act of violence, but as an example of how modern radicalization pathways can develop in fragmented ways. Researchers studying lone actor violence point to a combination of psychological isolation, exposure to ideological content, and personal interpretation as contributing elements. But even here, the limits of explanation are clear. These factors describe conditions, not destiny. The difficulty lies in prediction. Many individuals may experience isolation or encounter extreme content without ever translating that into action. Others may move toward violence without clear external warning signs. This unpredictability is one of the central challenges that continues to shape research in this field. For the families of victims, however, these analytical frameworks exist in a different emotional space. They may provide context, but they do not replace absence. The loss remains personal, unchanged by classification or explanation. In many ways, the most enduring impact of the attack is not found in its causes, but in its consequences. How lives were altered in ways that cannot be reversed or fully described. Over time, remembrance has taken on a structured form. Annual commemorations in Quebec City bring together members of the Muslim community, public officials, and citizens from diverse backgrounds. These events are not only about mourning, but also about reaffirming values of solidarity and coexistence. Names are read aloud, moments of silence are observed, and speeches emphasize both grief and resilience. But remembrance also exists outside of formal ceremonies. It exists in private prayers, in family conversations, in quiet moments inside the mosque when individuals reflect on those who are no longer present. Memory, in this sense, is not a single event. It is continuous. One of the most important shifts over time has been the way the mosque community itself has reclaimed its space. The Islamic Cultural Center is not defined solely by what happened there. It is defined by everything that continues to happen there. Teaching, gathering, worship, and support activities have re-established the building as a living institution rather than a frozen site of tragedy. Still, the past remains part of its identity, not as a dominant presence, but as a layer within a larger narrative. This layering is characteristic of many places affected by violence. They do not return to what they were before. Instead, they become something more complex. Spaces where continuity and memory coexist. In broader Canadian society, the attack is often referenced in discussions about national identity and the meaning of multicultural coexistence. It challenges simplified narratives of safety and inclusion by showing how vulnerability can exist even in societies that value diversity. At the same time, the response to the attack, public solidarity, political condemnation, and community support, also reflects those same values in action. This duality is important. The event exposed fracture, but it also revealed connection. It showed how quickly violence can disrupt trust, but also how communities can respond with resilience and solidarity. As time passes, the intensity of public attention fades, but the significance of the event does not diminish. It becomes part of institutional memory, something taught, studied, and referenced as part of understanding modern society. The name of Alexander Bissonnette remains attached to that history, not as a focus of fascination, but as a marker within a broader narrative about violence and its consequences. Ultimately, the epilogue of this case is not closure in the emotional sense. It is continuity. The story does not end. It integrates. It becomes part of how a community understands itself, part of how a country reflects on its vulnerabilities, and part of how individuals continue their lives while carrying memory forward. And in that sense, the most important outcome of the tragedy is not only what was lost, but how those who remain choose to live afterward. With remembrance, with caution, and with a continued commitment to ensuring that spaces of worship remain places of life rather than fear. In the years following the Quebec City mosque attack, the case gradually transitioned from a national tragedy into a permanent reference point within multiple fields of study. It was no longer discussed only in terms of immediate shock or legal outcome, but as part of a broader attempt to understand how isolated acts of mass violence emerge in modern societies. The name of Alexander Bissonnette became embedded in academic literature, policy discussions, and psychological research, not as a subject of fascination, but as a case study in complexity. One of the most significant shifts in post-event analysis was the move away from single-cause explanations. Early public discourse often searches for a clear trigger, an ideology, an event, a personal grievance. But as research deepened, it became increasingly clear that such attacks rarely emerge from a single origin point. Instead, they develop through layered and intersecting influences that accumulate over time. In this case, analysts identified a combination of factors that contributed to the attacker's trajectory: social isolation, psychological vulnerability, exposure to online ideological narratives, and personal interpretation of identity-related conflict. However, each of these elements alone was insufficient to explain the outcome. Their significance lay in their interaction, not their individual presence. This insight has had lasting implications for how law enforcement and mental health professionals approach prevention, rather than focusing exclusively on identifying warning signs, which can often be ambiguous or common in nonviolent individuals. The emphasis has shifted toward understanding patterns of escalation and contextual convergence. Even then, prediction remains extremely difficult. Another major area of study has been the role of digital environments. The attack occurred in a period when online spaces had become deeply integrated into everyday life, but analytical tools for understanding their influence were still evolving. Researchers examining the case noted how fragmented content consumption, algorithmic recommendation systems, and isolated browsing habits can contribute to the formation of highly individualized ideological pathways. However, experts also caution against oversimplifying this relationship. The Internet does not create violent intent on its own. Rather, it provides access to a wide spectrum of content that individuals interpret differently depending on their psychological and emotional state. In other words, the same material can have entirely different effects depending on the person engaging with it. This complexity is central to why the case continues to be studied. It resists reduction. It does not fit neatly into models that rely on linear causality. Instead, it illustrates a nonlinear process in which multiple weak signals accumulate until they reach a threshold that is only recognizable in hindsight. From a sociological perspective, the attack also prompted renewed examination of integration, belonging, and identity in multicultural societies. Quebec City, like many urban centers, is characterized by a diverse population with varying cultural and linguistic backgrounds. In such environments, questions of inclusion are not abstract. They are lived experiences shaped by daily interaction. The mosque itself, as a community institution, played a central role in this dynamic. It functioned not only as a religious space, but also as a social anchor where individuals negotiated identity, belonging, and cultural continuity. The attack disrupted that space temporarily, but it did not dismantle its role. Instead, it highlighted its importance. In policy discussions, one of the most difficult challenges has been balancing security with openness. Following the attack, there were calls for increased protection at places of worship across Canada. Some communities installed security cameras, implemented controlled entry points, or coordinated with local law enforcement for increased monitoring during prayer times. However, these measures raised concerns about the transformation of sacred spaces into monitored environments. Religious leaders and community members often emphasized that while safety is necessary, it should not come at the cost of altering the fundamental nature of worship. This tension remains unresolved in many contexts. Psychologically, the case has contributed to ongoing research into what is sometimes referred to as pre-incident pathways. These pathways attempt to describe the gradual progression of cognitive and behavioral changes that may precede acts of extreme violence. Yet even within this framework, uncertainty remains high. One of the key findings is that many individuals who later commit violent acts do not exhibit behavior that is clearly distinguishable from nonviolent individuals in advance. This makes intervention extremely challenging without risking overreach or misinterpretation. The result is a persistent gap between understanding in hindsight and actionable prediction in real time. Within Canada's legal and institutional framework, the case has also influenced discussions about sentencing, responsibility, and the classification of mass violence. The judicial process surrounding Alexander Bissonnette became a reference point in debates about how the justice system should respond to ideologically influenced violent acts. Yet legal resolution does not equate to societal resolution. Courts can determine guilt and impose sentences, but they cannot fully address the underlying conditions that allow such events to occur. This distinction has become increasingly central in public policy discourse. From a cultural perspective, the attack has also been reflected in literature, film, journalism, and academic writing. Each medium interprets the event differently. Journalism focuses on chronology and fact. Academia focuses on patterns and systems. Literature and documentary storytelling often focus on human experience and emotional memory. Together, these interpretations form a layered narrative that continues to evolve. The event is no longer a single story, but a collection of perspectives that attempt to make sense of the same reality from different angles. Importantly, the memory of the victims remains at the center of these discussions. While analysis often focuses on the perpetrator or the system, community remembrance emphasizes the individuals whose lives were lost. Their absence is not abstract. It is deeply personal and continually present for those who knew them. Over time, the Quebec City mosque attack has become more than a historical event. It has become a lens through which broader questions are examined. How do individuals become isolated? How do ideas circulate in digital spaces? How do communities respond to trauma? How does a society balance freedom and safety? These questions remain open. And perhaps they always will. Because the most enduring lesson of the case is not that it can be fully explained, but that it cannot be fully contained within any single explanation. And in that sense, the story of Alexander Bissonnette continues, not as an active event, but as an ongoing inquiry into the fragile boundaries between isolation, belief, and action in the modern world. In the long arc of analyzing the Quebec City mosque attack, one of the most persistent challenges has been separating explanation from simplicity. As time passes, there is a natural human tendency to compress complex events into understandable narratives. We look for a single cause, a defining moment, or a clear trajectory. But the case involving Alexander Bissonnette resists that compression at every level. What emerges instead is not a straight line, but a convergence of conditions, psychological, social, and environmental, that interacted in ways that only became visible after the event itself. This is one of the central paradoxes in the study of mass violence. Clarity often arrives only after the consequences are irreversible. From a psychological perspective, researchers studying similar cases emphasize that isolation is rarely a simple absence of social contact. It is often a subjective experience. Someone can be surrounded by people and still feel disconnected, misunderstood, or fundamentally separate from their environment. This internal state does not automatically lead to violence, but it can become one of several contributing factors when combined with other influences. In the case of the Quebec City mosque attack, analysts noted that the progression toward violence did not appear as a sudden transformation, but rather as a gradual narrowing of perspective. Over time, the individual's interpretive framework became more rigid, less receptive to alternative viewpoints, and increasingly shaped by selective information intake. However, even this description is retrospective. It is constructed from fragments of behavior reconstructed after the fact. One of the most difficult aspects for investigators and researchers alike is that none of these indicators are unique to individuals who commit violence. Many people experience isolation, engage in online echo chambers, or struggle with identity without ever approaching harmful action. This creates a fundamental problem for prevention: the absence of reliable differentiation in real time. The digital environment adds another layer of complexity. Online platforms do not operate as single ideological systems, but as vast ecosystems of content. Within these ecosystems, individuals navigate through algorithmically influenced pathways that can reinforce existing interests and gradually narrow exposure to opposing perspectives. However, the effect of this process varies dramatically depending on the individual's psychological state and interpretive lens. In the case associated with Alexander Bissonnette, analysts observe patterns consistent with selective engagement rather than uniform ideological absorption. This distinction is important. It suggests that influence is not passive but actively interpreted. The individual does not simply absorb content. They filter, reinterpret, and assign meaning based on internal cognitive frameworks. This insight has significant implications for how society understands responsibility and prevention. If interpretation plays such a central role, then identical content can produce entirely different outcomes depending on who encounters it. This undermines any simplistic assumption that exposure alone is determinative. From a sociological perspective, the case also raises questions about belonging and identity formation in modern societies. Quebec City, like many urban environments, is structured around multiple overlapping identities: linguistic, cultural, religious, and generational. For most individuals, these identities coexist without conflict. But for some, they may feel fragmented or difficult to reconcile. When identity becomes experienced as fragmented, individuals may seek coherence through simplified narratives. These narratives can provide psychological stability by reducing complexity, but they can also narrow perception. Importantly, this process is not inherently violent. It is a human response to uncertainty. The critical question is not whether simplification occurs, but how it evolves over time and what additional influences interact with it. In the aftermath of the attack, policymakers and researchers attempted to identify points of intervention that might interrupt such trajectories. Early identification of risk, improved mental health support, and community engagement initiatives were all discussed as potential strategies. However, each of these approaches faces structural limitations. Early identification risks false positives and privacy concerns. Mental health interventions require voluntary participation and sustained trust. Community engagement depends on long-term relationship building rather than reactive measures. None of these systems can guarantee prevention in isolation. This leads to one of the most uncomfortable conclusions in the field: that complete prevention of rare, low-frequency, high-impact events may not be achievable through any single framework. Instead, societies must focus on risk reduction, resilience, and rapid response, rather than absolute prevention. Within this broader context, the figure of Alexander Bissonnette becomes less a focal point of individual analysis and more a reference point in systemic study. The goal is not to center the individual, but to understand the convergence of conditions that allowed the event to occur. Another important dimension is memory. Collective memory does not remain static, it evolves over time. Immediately after an event, memory is highly emotional and fragmented. Over years, it becomes structured, integrated into narratives of identity, history, and policy. In Quebec City, the mosque attack has undergone this transformation, moving from immediate shock to long-term reflection. Yet even as memory stabilizes in public discourse, it remains deeply personal for those directly affected. For families and survivors, there is no final stage of processing that replaces earlier stages. Instead, memory coexists with daily life, sometimes quiet, sometimes reactivated by anniversaries, media coverage, or personal reflection. This dual structure of memory, public and private, creates a layered reality in which the same event exists in multiple forms simultaneously. In public discourse, it is a case study. In private experience, it is loss. The challenge for societies is to hold both realities without reducing one to the other. In educational and institutional contexts, the attack is increasingly used as a case study not only in criminology but also in ethics, psychology, and public policy. Students are encouraged to examine it not as a story with a moral endpoint, but as a complex system of interacting factors. This approach reflects a broader shift in how modern societies attempt to learn from traumatic events. However, even in academic settings, there is a risk of abstraction. When events become data points, there is always a danger that human experience becomes secondary to analysis. Maintaining balance between understanding systems and honoring individuals remains an ongoing ethical challenge. Ultimately, the deeper reflection emerging from this case is not about identifying a single explanation, but about accepting the limits of explanation itself. The world is not always legible in real time. Patterns become visible only in retrospect, and even then, they remain incomplete. The story of Alexander Bissonnette continues to be studied not because it provides answers, but because it raises questions that remain unresolved about identity, isolation, interpretation, and the fragile boundary between thought and action. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. That understanding is not a final destination, but an ongoing process, shaped as much by what we know as by what we cannot fully know. As the Quebec City mosque attack continues to be examined years after its occurrence, one of the most significant realizations emerging from multidisciplinary analysis is that modern acts of mass violence cannot be fully understood through isolated lenses. The case involving Alexander Bissonnette has become a reference point precisely because it resists singular interpretation. It exists at the intersection of psychology, sociology, digital culture, and legal structure, and each of these domains explains only a portion of the whole. In earlier phases of investigation and public discourse, there was a natural inclination to search for clarity in the form of identifiable causes. People wanted to know what led to the event in a linear sense. But as research deepened, it became increasingly apparent that linear causality is insufficient for describing phenomena that emerge from complex adaptive systems. Instead, what appears is a convergence model. In this model, no single factor is decisive on its own. Rather, multiple weak signals, environmental conditions, and internal psychological processes interact over time. These interactions do not follow a predictable sequence. They accumulate, shift, and sometimes remain dormant until a triggering context allows them to align. This is where analytical difficulty begins, because from the outside, many of the contributing elements appear ordinary. Social withdrawal, online activity, personal frustration, or ideological curiosity are all common human experiences. What distinguishes cases like this is not the presence of these elements, but their specific configuration and evolution over time. The challenge for researchers is that this configuration is only visible in hindsight. Before the event, there is no clear boundary marking where normal variation ends and risk begins. This creates a fundamental tension in prevention efforts. Systems are asked to identify rare outcomes using signals that are not inherently rare. Within this context, the case of Alexander Bissonnette has been studied extensively as an example of interpretive convergence rather than deterministic progression. The emphasis has shifted away from predicting individuals toward understanding pathways of interaction. One of the most important insights from this shift is that behavior is not produced by static traits alone. Instead, it emerges through interaction between internal states and external environments. This includes psychological disposition, social context, and informational exposure. None of these elements operate independently. Digital environments, in particular, have added complexity to this interaction model. Unlike traditional media systems, digital platforms do not present information in a linear sequence. They organize content through dynamic recommendation systems that respond to user engagement patterns. This creates individualized information ecosystems that evolve differently for each user. However, it is crucial to avoid deterministic interpretations of digital influence. The presence of content does not equate to its acceptance. Individuals interpret, resist, or reinterpret information based on prior beliefs, emotional states, and cognitive frameworks. This means that influence is always mediated, never direct. In the Quebec City case, analysts observed that online exposure played a role in shaping interpretive context, but not in isolation. It functioned as one layer among many, interacting with personal and social dimensions. This reinforces a broader conclusion in contemporary research. Influence is probabilistic, not causal in a strict sense. From a societal perspective, this raises difficult questions about responsibility. If behavior emerges from complex systems rather than single causes, then responsibility cannot be assigned to one domain alone. It becomes distributed across multiple layers: individual, technological, cultural, and institutional. This does not dilute accountability, rather, it complicates it. Legal systems are designed to assign responsibility to individuals, because that is the most concrete and operationally manageable unit. But systemic understanding suggests that focusing solely on individuals may overlook upstream conditions that shape behavior. At the same time, shifting focus entirely to systems risks losing sight of individual agency. Even within complex environments, individuals make choices. Those choices are shaped but not eliminated by context. This dual reality, structure and agency coexisting, is one of the most enduring philosophical tensions in the study of human behavior. The attack carried out by Alexander Bissonnette sits precisely within this tension. It is neither fully explainable as individual pathology, nor reducible to environmental influence. It exists in the overlapping space between the two. Another important dimension of long-term analysis is institutional learning. After events like this, institutions often undergo a phase of reflection, adjustment, and partial restructuring. This includes law enforcement protocols, community outreach programs, and policy discussions around prevention and intervention. However, institutional learning is inherently slow and often incomplete. Systems adapt incrementally rather than transform radically. This means that while improvements may occur, they rarely eliminate underlying vulnerabilities. Instead, they shift how those vulnerabilities are managed. In parallel, public memory continues to evolve. Over time, traumatic events move through stages of collective processing. Immediate shock gives way to narrative formation, which then stabilizes into historical reference. But even stable narratives can be reactivated by new events, anniversaries, or social discussions. In Quebec City, the mosque attack has entered this stabilized narrative phase, but it has not become static. It remains active in public consciousness, particularly within the communities most directly affected. Memory here is not archival. It is lived. This distinction is critical. Archival memory stores events as information. Lived memory integrates them into identity and experience. In the Islamic Cultural Center, both forms coexist. The building functions as a site of worship, but also as a site of remembrance. These roles are not contradictory, they are layered. Over time, this layering becomes part of resilience. Resilience in this context does not mean forgetting or returning to a previous state. It means continuing forward while carrying memory in structured ways that allow daily life to function without erasing the past. In broader academic discourse, the case continues to be used to illustrate the limits of explanatory models. Whether psychological, sociological, or computational, no single framework can fully account for the emergence of such events. Each provides partial insight, but none achieves total coverage. This has led to a growing acceptance of epistemic humility in the field of violence prevention research. Epistemic humility is the recognition that some aspects of human behavior will remain partially unpredictable, even with advanced data and analysis. This does not imply resignation, but rather a realistic calibration of expectations. The implication is that prevention must operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Improving mental health access, strengthening community networks, monitoring digital risks responsibly, and ensuring rapid response capacity. None of these measures is sufficient alone, but together they form a layered approach to risk reduction. Ultimately, the continued study of Alexander Bissonnette is not about centering an individual, but about understanding a system. The system includes psychological development, social environment, digital ecosystems, institutional structures, and cultural narratives. And even then, the system is not fully visible. It is inferred through traces, reconstructed through evidence, and interpreted through frameworks that evolve over time. This is why the case remains relevant. Not because it offers closure, but because it highlights the absence of final closure in complex human systems. In the end, the most important realization is not about what we know, but about how we know. Understanding is partial, layered, and always subject to revision. And in that sense, the story does not end with explanation. It continues as inquiry. In the long aftermath of the Quebec City mosque attack, as years accumulate and immediate shock fades into historical memory, a different kind of question begins to emerge. It is no longer only about what happened, or how it happened, but about what it means to remember something like this in a society that continues to move forward. The case involving Alexander Bissonnette remains present not only in legal archives and academic studies, but in the quieter spaces of collective consciousness where memory is constantly reshaped by time. Memory in this context is not a fixed record. It is an active process. It changes depending on who is remembering, when they are remembering, and for what purpose. For some, the attack is a national reference point in discussions about violence and security. For others, it is a deeply personal wound that never fully transitions into the past. These two forms of memory coexist, sometimes uneasily, within the same society. One of the most difficult ethical questions that arises from cases like this is how to balance remembrance of victims with understanding of perpetrators. Public discourse often struggles with this balance. On one hand, there is a need to honor and center those who lost their lives. On the other, there is a need to understand the conditions that allowed the event to occur. These goals can sometimes appear to be in tension, even though both are essential for a complete understanding. In academic and institutional contexts, the emphasis is usually placed on analysis. Researchers examine behavioral patterns, social environments, and structural factors. They attempt to extract lessons that may help reduce the likelihood of similar events in the future. But in doing so, there is always a risk of abstraction, of turning lived human experience into data points within a model. In community contexts, the emphasis is different. Their memory is not abstract but embodied. It exists in the routines of daily life, in the physical spaces where events occurred, and in the relationships between individuals who share that history. The Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec is one such space where these layers of meaning coexist. It is both a functioning place of worship and a site of remembrance. This duality creates a complex emotional environment. For some who attend the mosque, presence itself becomes an act of continuity and resilience. For others, it requires navigating feelings that are not easily resolved. There is no single emotional response that defines the community. Instead, there is a spectrum of experiences shaped by time, proximity, and personal history. Over time, societies often develop rituals of remembrance to give structure to collective memory. These rituals, anniversaries, vigils, public statements, serve multiple functions. They honor those who were lost, reaffirm shared values, and create moments of pause in the ongoing flow of everyday life. But they also risk becoming symbolic over time, detached from the immediate emotional reality that originally gave them meaning. The challenge, then, is maintaining sincerity within repetition. How does a society continue to remember without allowing remembrance to become routine? There is no simple answer to this question, and different communities approach it in different ways. In Canada, the Quebec City mosque attack has become part of a broader narrative about pluralism, vulnerability, and coexistence. It is referenced in political discourse not only as a tragedy, but as a turning point in national reflection about the safety of minority communities. Yet even within this framing, there is recognition that no single event can define an entire social reality. The presence of Alexander Bissonnette in these discussions is often indirect. It appears not as a focus of attention, but as a reference point within broader conversations about violence and responsibility. Over time, this shift, from individual focus to systemic reflection, marks an important transformation in how societies process traumatic events. Ethically, there is also an ongoing question about narrative responsibility. Who has the right to tell the story of such an event? Survivors, families, journalists, researchers, policymakers all contribute different perspectives. Each perspective is partial, and yet each is necessary. The full picture only emerges through the accumulation of these partial views. This plurality of narratives reflects a deeper truth about memory itself. It is never singular. It is always composed of overlapping interpretations that evolve over time. Even official accounts, such as court records or investigative reports, represent structured interpretations rather than complete realities. In psychological terms, long-term processing of trauma does not follow a linear path. There is no final stage at which memory becomes fully resolved. Instead, memory integrates into identity. It becomes part of how individuals understand themselves and the world around them. This integration can be stable, but it is never static. For communities affected by violence, this means that the past is never fully closed. It may recede in emotional intensity, but it remains present in meaning. This presence is not necessarily negative. It can also become a source of solidarity, reflection, and renewed commitment to shared values. At the societal level, one of the most important outcomes of analyzing such events is the recognition of complexity as a permanent condition. There is no final explanatory framework that resolves all questions. Each new layer of analysis reveals additional questions. This does not indicate failure of understanding, but rather the depth of the phenomenon being studied. The case of Alexander Bissonnette therefore functions as more than a historical record. It operates as a lens through which broader issues are continuously re-examined. The nature of isolation, the dynamics of belief, the structure of digital environments, and the fragility of public spaces. But perhaps the most enduring insight is not analytical at all. It is human. Behind every layer of interpretation, legal, psychological, sociological, there remains the reality of lives interrupted and communities changed. No framework can fully absorb that reality without remainder. This is why remembrance persists, not because it solves anything, but because it acknowledges what cannot be solved. And in that acknowledgement, there is a form of meaning that is not explanatory, but ethical. It does not answer all questions. It simply insists that the questions remain visible. In the end, the story does not conclude in resolution. It continues in memory, in reflection, and in the ongoing effort to understand without assuming that understanding will ever be complete. And that, perhaps, is the final truth of this case. That some events are not meant to be fully closed, but continuously carried, carefully, consciously, and with awareness of both their weight and their lessons. When a society looks back at an event like the Quebec City mosque attack, time does something subtle but profound. It does not erase the event, nor does it diminish its importance. Instead, it changes the texture of how the event is perceived. What was once immediate and overwhelming becomes layered, interpreted, and reframed through memory, discourse, and institutional reflection. The case involving Alexander Bissonnette now exists primarily in this layered form, no longer a breaking event, but a permanent reference point in how modern societies think about violence, identity, and collective responsibility. At the heart of long-term reflection lies a simple but difficult truth. Understanding does not bring closure in the way people often expect. Instead, understanding expands the space in which questions exist. The more deeply a case is studied, the more complex it becomes. Each explanation reveals additional variables. Each conclusion opens further uncertainty. This is not a failure of analysis, but a reflection of the complexity of human behavior itself. In the early aftermath of the attack, public attention naturally focused on immediacy, what happened, who was responsible, and how such an event could occur in a place of worship in a peaceful city. These questions are essential, but they belong to the first stage of collective processing. Over time, the focus shifts, the urgency fades, and in its place emerges a slower, more reflective inquiry into meaning, context, and prevention. One of the most important realizations that has emerged in the years since is that violence of this nature cannot be reduced to a single explanatory pathway. The life trajectory of Alexander Bissonnette has been examined through psychological, sociological, and digital cultural frameworks, but none of these perspectives alone can fully account for the outcome. This does not mean that explanation is impossible. It means that explanation is necessarily plural. In psychology, the emphasis has often been placed on internal states, identity formation, emotional regulation, cognitive framing, and vulnerability to isolation. In sociology, attention shifts toward social belonging, community structure, and cultural narratives. In digital studies, the focus is on information environments, algorithmic exposure, and fragmented media consumption. Each discipline contributes insight, but none provides total coverage. The intersection of these domains is where complexity becomes most visible. Human behavior is not produced in a vacuum. It is shaped by continuous interaction between internal interpretation and external environment. But this interaction is not linear or predictable. It is dynamic, recursive, and often only legible after outcomes have already occurred. This retrospective clarity creates a paradox. The more information is gathered, the more apparent it becomes that prediction is limited. This does not diminish the value of investigation. Rather, it reframes its purpose. The goal is not perfect foresight, but improved understanding and reduced vulnerability. In practical terms, this has influenced how institutions approach prevention. Rather than relying on identifying specific individuals as predictable risks, the emphasis has shifted toward strengthening systems of support, communication, and early intervention capacity. Mental health services, community outreach programs, and digital literacy initiatives are all part of this broader strategy. But even together, they cannot eliminate uncertainty. Uncertainty remains a defining feature of complex societies. It cannot be engineered away. It can only be managed. Within the community most directly affected by the attack, memory functions differently than it does in institutional or academic contexts. For survivors, families, and members of the Islamic Cultural Center, memory is not an object of analysis. It is part of lived experience. It appears in anniversaries, in conversations, in silence, and in the physical space of the mosque itself. The mosque is not defined by the attack, but it is also not separate from it. It exists in a dual state, as a place of worship and as a site of remembrance. This duality does not create contradiction. It creates depth. It reflects the reality that spaces can carry multiple histories simultaneously. For many communities affected by violence, rebuilding is not a return to a previous state. It is the creation of a new continuity that includes the past without being defined solely by it. This process is gradual and uneven. It does not follow a fixed timeline. Some individuals find stability quickly, while others carry long-term emotional effects that remain present in subtle ways. At the societal level, remembrance becomes structured through rituals, education, and public discourse. These structures serve to preserve memory across generations, ensuring that events are not lost to time. But they also risk simplifying complex realities into symbolic narratives. This tension between preservation and simplification is an ongoing challenge in collective memory. In Canada, the Quebec City mosque attack is now part of a broader historical narrative about multiculturalism, public safety, and social cohesion. It is referenced in policy discussions, academic research, and public education. But its meaning is not fixed. It evolves as society evolves, influenced by new events, new interpretations, and new generations who did not experience it directly. This generational shift is particularly important. For those who lived through the event, memory is anchored in experience. For those who learn about it later, memory is mediated through representation, texts, documentaries, discussions, and institutional accounts. These two forms of memory coexist, but are not identical. Over time, the figure of Alexander Bissonnette becomes less a subject of immediate attention, and more a reference within a broader system of understanding. His role is contextual rather than central in ongoing discourse. This reflects a broader pattern in how societies process perpetrators of mass violence. Over time, focus shifts from individuals to systems, from actions to conditions. Yet even within systemic analysis, the human dimension remains unavoidable. Behind every framework are real people whose lives were changed irreversibly. No model, no theory, and no explanation can fully absorb that fact. It remains the limit point of analysis. Perhaps the most important insight that emerges from long-term reflection is that understanding and closure are not the same thing. Understanding expands knowledge. Closure suggests finality. But in cases like this, finality is not fully available. The event becomes part of ongoing memory rather than completed history. This does not mean that healing is impossible. It means that healing does not require forgetting. It is possible for memory and continuity to coexist. It is possible for societies to move forward while still carrying the weight of past events. In this sense, the legacy of the Quebec City mosque attack is not defined solely by the violence that occurred, but by the responses it generated, legal, institutional, communal, and personal. It is defined by how people chose to respond, rebuild, and remember. And in the end, perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of all. Not the moment of rupture itself, but the long and ongoing process of making meaning after rupture has occurred. Because the story does not truly end. It continues in memory, in reflection, and in the way societies quietly, persistently try to understand what cannot be fully understood, and to live forward while still carrying what cannot be left behind.